So the next 21st century culture war that I'm going to talk about has to do with LGBTQ plus acceptance and the fight for LGBTQ rights. The first thing I want to show you here is this chart, and I don't know if you've ever seen something like it, but it really is quite staggering. The rate of support for gay marriage and in general a lot of kind of gay rights, gay acceptance issues just fundamentally changed in a generation. We went from a world where in the late 80s about 11% of people approved of gay marriage, and then that number is a solid majority by the mid-2010s, right? And this is such a drastic shift, and I won't be able to talk about all the different sociological reasons about why that happened, but certainly it's an example of a pretty profound change in American life. I want to at least try to root that change in some historical activism and social change that happened. I mean, at some level, we can go back to the simulation. We saw a rising tide of activism and increased visibility of LGBTQ plus people ever since the 1970s. We have the gay liberation movement. We have, as early as the 1970s, anti-discrimination laws passed in various cities, including Champaign-Urbana by 1976. In the 1980s, the big defining event was the AIDS crisis. Now, as you may know, there's this sexually transmitted disease called HIV that once contracted will develop into AIDS. And in the early years before treatments were developed, AIDS was usually fatal. And early on, the disease was primarily associated with gay men because the vast majority of early victims were gay men. This was incredibly tragic for the tightly knit gay communities in major cities, as virtually everyone living there knew someone, and probably a lot of people who died. There's this really striking image of the San Francisco Gay Man's Choir, where basically, the surviving members are wearing those white shirts, and all the people facing backwards in the black tuxedos represents people who died in the AIDS epidemic. Now, the AIDS crisis is a pivotal moment in the history of the gay rights movement. On the one hand, it actually spurred the movement in various ways. It certainly increased the visibility of gay men, and in many cases elicited sympathy as gay men were dying of a disease that no one understood. Additionally, it was a major stimulus to gay activism as the LGBTQ community mobilized to pressure American society at large, and particularly the Reagan and Bush administrations, to do more to address the epidemic, addressing more money to researching and producing treatments, for example. However, in addition to the obvious tragedy of so many members of the gay community dying of AIDS, it was bad for other reasons. Since it was a sexually transmitted disease, it provided more evidence for certain folks that gay men were promiscuous and morally degenerate. Some even saw it as punishment from God. Jerry Falwell, none other than Jerry Falwell, said, "AIDS is not just God's punishment for homosexuals, it is God's punishment for the society that tolerates homosexuals." Additionally, since people didn't really understand the disease and how it spread, and therefore, people discriminated against people with AIDS or gay men in general, just thinking we can't even get close to them or touch them without getting the disease. Obviously, a crucial epic in the history of the LGBT. So the AIDS pandemic still lasts to this day and still, causes thousands of deaths every year, but it's also fair to say that by the early 1990s, the scope of it and the death rate started to decline a little bit, and the battle over gay rights started to take on other focuses. For example, a major cultural firestorm emerged in the 1990s over whether gay men should be allowed to serve in the military. Democratic President Bill Clinton initially campaigned on making this reform. He faced such pushback from cultural conservatives once he arrived in office that he eventually settled on this don't ask, don't tell policy, which said they could serve as long as they stayed. Another big issue is these statewide ballot initiatives that try to limit gay rights in state law. You can see the particularly egregious language in the Oregon ballot initiative, which says that these are abnormal behaviors that must not be encouraged by the state. That one almost passes, but doesn't. The one in Colorado, which just says that you cannot have anti-discrimination laws at the city level against gay people. So basically, the state of Colorado trying to stop cities like Boulder from enacting anti-gay discrimination laws. That actually does pass, though, thanks to the activism of various gay rights organizations. It goes to the Supreme Court, who overthrows it. But again, this whole issue of whether we can have anti-discrimination language against gay people continues to be an issue all the way back to the 70s, and it's still an issue in the 90s, and actually it's still an issue today. Another one is in 1996, there's something called the Defense of Marriage Act that's signed at the federal level, which is a federal law that says for the purpose of the federal government, like for federal taxes, marriage is strictly defined as being between a man and a woman, and thus explicitly leaving out gay marriage. And that law was on the books for a while before the Supreme Court eventually overthrew that as well. Since 2000, there have been a number of important trends for the LGBTQ community, and in the last 20 years is when we've really seen this really drastic public opinion change. A lot of this is going on in popular culture. If we look on TV, there's far more LGBT characters. There are far more celebrities and actors who are out. We can also see it in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, the shift in these views on whether homosexuality should be accepted by society or whether gay marriage should be legal. A lot of these public opinion questions show really drastic change. Another thing we've seen is the mainstreaming of pride parades, which started as these pretty radical things from the 1970s, and they now get sort of widespread support from straight communities. Indeed, there's so much embrace of pride parades that some LGBT activists feel the pride parade has almost gotten watered down. I found this headline, "Has gay pride become too straight?" I've also seen the critique that it's become too corporate. But the fact that we're in a world where the debate is whether pride parades have become too corporate, right, too mainstream, I think tells you something about how things are changing. And crucially, in the last 5 years or so, there's been a broader shift, really a big shift in visibility of trans people, a broader acceptance and a transformation in the language that many people use to talk about gender and gender identity. Now, to be clear on all these things, there's a sizable minority who isn't changing, who resents these changes, and LGBTQ people continue to experience criticism and judgment, but the social change is still notable. And along with these social changes, we've also seen crucial legal changes too. Various ordinances against discrimination, but crucial is the issue of gay marriage. A lot of things happened at the state level in the 1990s and the 2010s. First, there were these things called civil unions that conferred the rights of marriage without calling it marriage. That was the compromise. But more and more states started pushing towards actual marriage. Additionally, as more and more states started pushing towards actual marriage, there were also more conservative states that explicitly put on the books that marriage is between a man or a woman. And we start to have this state-by-state battle over gay marriage. As you might know, the big thing that settled this on a national level happened fairly recently. You were probably in middle school or whatever, and that's the Obergefell decision in 2015. And it defines gay marriage as a civil right protected by the 14th Amendment. Remember that thing all the way back from Reconstruction. And thus, gay marriage becomes the national law of the land. Now, to be clear, that is not the end of the debate, and one of the things I'll be asking you to do perhaps for an activity, but also for something we'll do in class, is to really think of what are the arguments used by each side. There's still kind of pro-LGBT rights arguments that are made, and there are anti-LGBT rights arguments that are made. And we can see the sort of the conflict we have in modern day politics over these issues. More on that in class.